What is this recovery partition for on a fresh installation of Windows? I installed Windows 10 Preview on a fresh SSD and noticed that there is a tiny 450 MB recovery partition at the end of C. Ignore the extended partition containing F, as I added that myself afterwards. I'm pretty certain that no such partition appeared on a fresh installation of Windows 7, and I cannot remember seeing anything like that with Windows 8 or 8.1. So, is this new to Windows 10 and what is it for? What does this tiny partition contain?
Windows XP Setup creates only a single Windows partition. The Windows Recovery Console is not part of the default installation, but can be easily added to the Windows partition where it gets installed in a directory and takes roughly 7 MB of space. Only 512-byte native 512N drives supported. Advanced format AF 512-byte emulation 512E, and 4K native 4 knots drives not supported officially and not recommended. No GPT support for booting. XP64-bit can use GPT drives for data only. Windows Vista Setup creates only a single Windows partition in both BIOS/MBR and UEFI/GPT for 64-bit only modes. The Win-based Winner made its debut on the Vista DVD, but there is no easy way to install it on the hard drive since no installation routine is provided for it. Instead, tools and scripts provided as part of Wake need to be used to do this manually. Winner must be installed on a separate partition from the Vista system partition. Can be combined with BitLocker drive encryption, the partition if required. Recommended Winner partition size is around 1 GB when it is installed as an expanded image. AF512E drive supported with some updates/hotfixes, but AF4 not supported. Windows 7 In early pre-RTM builds, until at least 7057, the system reserved partition was 200 MB in size. The system reserved partition contains boot manager, bootner, boot configuration data, BCD, and startup files used for. Can also contain Winner. The system reserved partition minimum size is 100 MB, but it can be larger. It is marked active and must not be encrypted. In BIOS/MBR mode, it can be formatted as either FAT32 or NTFS. Setup uses NTFS. If Winner is not installed in the system reserved partition, for example if the partition is never created because Windows is installed on a pre-partitioned drive, it is installed in %system drive %/recovery instead. AF512E drive supported with some updates/hotfixes, but AF4 not supported. The ESC contains the NTLDR, HAL, boot.txt, and other files that are needed to boot the system, such as drivers. The MSR is used by the OS for disk management. The ESC must be formatted as FAT32. Same rules apply for Winner in UEFI/GPT mode as in BIOS/MBR mode. Windows 8. The system reserved partition contains Winner and related files. In BIOS/MBR mode, it can be formatted as either FAT32 or NTFS. Setup uses NTFS. AF512E drives supported in both BIOS/MBR and UEFI/GPT modes. The ESC must be formatted as FAT32. On AF4 NOTS drives, the minimum ESC size is 260 MB due to FAT32 partition size being calculated as sector size 4 kilobits x 65500 and 27 equals 256 MB. AF4 NOTS drives supported in UEFI/GPT mode only. Windows 10. AF512E drives supported in both BIOS/MBR and UEFI/GPT modes. The ESC must be formatted as FAT32. On AF4 NOTS drives, the minimum ESC size is 260 MB due to FAT32 partition size being calculated as sector size 4 kilobits x 65500 and 27 equals 256 MB. AF4 NOTS drives supported in UEFI/GPT mode only. TL, Doctor, a separate Winner partition, is created only by Windows 8 setup in UEFI/GPT mode, and by Windows 10 setup in both BIOS/MBR and UEFI/GPT modes. Sources: How to install the Windows Recovery Console. Install Recovery Console as a boot menu option on Windows XP. Windows Notes blog. Windows Vista Recovery Environment. Windows Vista Pre-installation Design, Partition Layout. Windows 7, Understanding Disk Partitions. Windows 7, Recommended BIOS-based disk partition configurations. Windows 7, Recommended UEFI-based disk partition configurations. Step-by-step Windows 8 deployment for IT professionals. Windows 8 Hard drives and partitions overview. Windows 8 Configure BIOS/MBR based hard drive partitions. Windows 8 Configure UEFI/GPT based hard drive partitions. Windows 10 Hard drives and partitions. Windows 10 BIOS/MBR based hard drive partitions. Windows 10 UEFI/GPT based hard drive partitions. Windows and GPT FAQ. Microsoft support policy for 4K sector hard drives in Windows. Advanced format 4K disk compatibility update. What is the system reserved partition and can you delete it? Windows 7 build numbers. Windows 7 system reserved partition size in early builds 1, 2. Windows Recovery Environment Technical Reference, Vista, Win 7, Win 8, Win 10.
Note that there are frequently several recovery partitions, one for each version of Windows for which you may want to roll back to, plus OEM recovery partitions. But some disk tools are confusing them or changing their so that OEM recovery and Windows recovery partitions may be mixed up. Anyway, the Winner Recovery Partition is normally installed by a tool named Reagent in Windows 10, which does not work and hangs frequently when it runs within the safe_os environment, running the Windows 10 installer, including when it runs automatically from Windows Update to install a new build of Windows 10, and that also fails when you want to use Reagent manually from normal mode. Reagent incorrectly computes the storage space it needs to install the recovery environment. You may finally see that Windows 10 has taken space on your disk to allocate one or several recovery partitions, and then updated the BCD store to make them as bootable, even though these partitions were not prepared, not formatted. In fact, you see them as raw partitions instead of NTFS partitions. On each following reboot, a new additional partition will be created again, taking space from the main partition, but ignoring the space already allocated for an earlier failed attempt to format the incorrectly set up recovery partition. You'll then need to drop those incorrect partitions, reclaim their space for use by the normal Windows partition. On my disk I have seen the repeated failed attempts to install the recovery leaving several gigabytes of storage, a 300 MB partition, then another 450 MB partition, then another 600 MB partition, each time requiring 150 MB more than with the previous attempt. Each time Winner failed, in fact, with error saying that the size was not sufficient for use, even if Windows 10 will never need more than 450 MB. On my disk, the many attempts allocated more than 60 GB on my SSD for these partitions, and I finally ran out of space on my 256 GB SSD, and could no longer boot Windows or even have it roll back. Note that when the Windows 10 installer rollbacks, it leaves these partitions as is, even if they are now unformatted raw partitions. You manually need to delete these unsued partitions. You'll also need to check the content of the BCD store, from the administrator command line, run, gedit/enum. You may see new root entries created for non-existent partitions/volumes. Check also the partitions from the command line, because the UI Disk Management control panel does not display everything, and sometimes refuses to let you delete those incorrect partitions if there it is set to some protected state. Diskpart has an additional option that allows you to force the deletion of these partitions that you can't drop from the Disk Management control panel. To see all existing volumes and see on which driver letters they are mounted, and which file system type they use, or if they are unformatted raw partitions, list volume. Select your Windows partition. Select volume in list part. Look at the correct partition number for the system disk, locate the small UEFI/boot FAT32 partition, locate the eventual OEM recovery partition. Then you may need to delete undesirable partitions on the disk, incorrectly installed by the Windows 10 installer due to the bug in Reagent, to recover the space they needlessly take. For some partition you may not use delete part to delete the selected partition, and the volume on it. These same partitions cannot be deleted as well in the Disk Management control panel. The options are grayed. But you may be able to do it from the command line with an additional parameter. Delete part override. But before extending your Windows partition again, leave the free space created by the deleted partitions. The Windows installer will not need to adjust again the size of the Windows partition and may now be able to allocate the recovery partition directly, without having to alter the C, Windows partition. Correcting the entries in the BCD store is much more complicated. The command line syntax to do it is horribly complicated. Most users are completely unable to use the Gedit and Diskpart tools themselves. They need technical support. This is very bad because it is the Windows 10 installer that corrupted automatically their partition tables in BCD store. Windows 10 installers are really too much automated, abuse of unattended automatic installation without any prior information of what it will attempt to do. Everything that changes the BCD store, incorrectly reading the BIOS info and mixing UEFI and MBR compatibility info, or partition scheme should not be done in an unattended way. In fact, all this could be done before rebooting into safe_os mode, with some interaction to confirm what will be done, and with proper logging. But Windows 10 installers in safe_os mode are just trying to guess what would be the best configuration, and too frequently their guess is simply wrong. It makes lots of confusions between drive numbers, volume numbers, partition numbers on specific drives, and sometimes it also mixes the drive letters or change their mapping. Unique volume identifiers are simply ignored. This is very bad and completely opposed to what Microsoft recommends and documents. Microsoft still ignores its own specifications that were discussed with third-party developers and OEMs. Failure on Windows 10 installation are really a nightmare to diagnose. Even the Microsoft Online Assistant does not understand the issues. And they even ignore the existing Windows diagnosing tools such as options of disk part or just the basic syntax of edit. Call them, maybe they'll start a support session with your PC, but you'll help them more than they'll help you, because users frequently know various things about Windows better than the official Microsoft support team. But maybe they'll help you locate a few things that you've forgotten to check. Beware! They may tell you to install the incorrect version of Windows, which will cause all your user data to be erased instead of being migrated. The Microsoft support just looks at what is shown in WinVer dialog, but does not look at the real version that is used. For example, they assume the Windows version is localized in the same language as the one you use, and still ignore that you may use a MUI language setting on top of a US English installation. The Windows installer also makes various false assumptions about what is on your system. The reagent component is the worst of all. It is almost undocumented, does not explain what it tries to do, does not log its actions, does not log its own errors, and offers almost no diagnostic. All I can say is that it incorrectly computes the space needed for installing the recovery environment and does not explain why it would need more than 300 MB for it. I think that reagent is incorrectly reading some data in the MSR partition, or fails in some cases where there are other disks mounted on RAID, USB, or mobile devices, or on connected printers, or flash cards, and it may be adding up space actually used for unrelated data on other disks, that will never be part of the recovery partition itself, or it tries to guess where is the winner source and finds some random directory somewhere which is actually not the source of the winner, and then it adds to be already allocated for a few other recovery partitions not meant for that version of Windows. My view of how Microsoft official support reacted, it learned much more from me than they helps me, and they did not understand what I was showing them with diskpart and edit, is that Microsoft actually does not really know how Windows really works, because there's an internal lack of training for their personnel, and because many parts of Windows were in fact designed by a small team no longer working for Microsoft, and now Microsoft needs help from third parties to guess how all this should work. This is problematic. Windows was proprietary, but internally badly documented, and now Microsoft does not really know how to manage the billions of lines of source code made by a lot of third parties, without real review. Windows will then be condemned to slow death as it has become unmaintainable and unsupported by Microsoft itself, and even third parties have huge difficulties to locate problems because of lack of internal documentation. This has never been worse since Microsoft pushed for unattended installations without asking users anything. Maybe it's time for Microsoft to think about creating their sold softwares and services on another OS, actually supported by a larger community. Microsoft should start creating its own Linux-based distribution, and just rebuild an UI layer on top of it. Microsoft should help developing Wine for Linux. Microsoft has already said that Windows 10 would be the last commercial version of Windows. I predict that it will start dying in about 10 years, and that the next OS for supporting apps developed for Windows will be in fact Linux, and that Edge will be ported to Linux. Already, Office 365 and Azure are supporting Linux and third-party browsers. Windows and browsers will no longer be strategic for selling Microsoft solutions. Windows and Internet Explorer/Edge are just costing more to Microsoft than what they generate in revenues, and Microsoft is unable to sustain the technical support for them without paying third parties.
If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing.